The forest was alive with sound. Birds fluttered overhead. The leaves rustled in the gentle breeze, and the distant calls of wild animals echoed through the trees. But amid all the sounds, there was one that stood out: an unusual silence. A momentary pause in the otherwise bustling forest. A lone figure moved through the thick underbrush, a human. Dressed in a green camouflage outfit, they stepped carefully, mindful of the animals they might disturb. The person was no stranger to the wild, having spent years working as a wildlife protector. They knew the land, the animals, and their behavior like the back of their hand. But today, something was different. The forest felt tense, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. The human's name was Sarah. She had dedicated her life to protecting wildlife, specifically big cats and other predators. Today, she was tracking a lioness who had recently been seen in the area with her cub. There were rumors that the lioness had been acting unusually calm, an unexpected behavior for a predator so fierce and territorial. Sarah was curious, and it wasn't just the lioness that piqued her interest. She had heard whispers of something even more remarkable: stories of wild predators allowing humans to come near their cubs without showing aggression. As Sarah ventured deeper into the heart of the forest, the tension in the air grew. She could sense that she was not alone, that something, or someone, was watching her. She paused, crouching low to the ground, blending into the environment as best as she could. Her eyes scanned the surroundings, trying to pick out any movement in the dense foliage. And then she saw it, a flash of golden fur just beyond the tree line. The lioness. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had been tracking this particular lioness for weeks, but she had never seen her this close. The lioness was watching her from a distance, her amber eyes glowing with a fierce yet curious intensity. Sarah could feel the power radiating from the animal, a presence so strong it seemed to vibrate in the very air around her. But what struck Sarah was not just the lioness's power, it was her calmness. The lioness didn't seem agitated. She wasn't growling or showing her teeth, as wild predators often do when they feel threatened. Instead, she stood still, her body tense, but her eyes never leaving Sarah's. It was as if she were studying the human, trying to make sense of her presence. Sarah slowly stood up, keeping her movements slow and deliberate, not wanting to startle the lioness. She was used to dealing with wild animals, but she had never encountered one like this before. She could sense that there was something different about this lioness, something that made her more than just a predator. And then, as if to confirm her thoughts, the lioness took a step forward. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The lioness was coming closer, but not in an aggressive manner. It was as if she were inviting Sarah to come closer, to bridge the gap between them. But Sarah knew better than to make any sudden moves. She stood still, watching the lioness with both awe and caution. And then, out of nowhere, something extraordinary happened. The lioness let out a soft, low growl, a sound that Sarah had never heard from her before. But instead of feeling threatened, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The lioness was not warning her. She was simply trying to communicate. Sarah's eyes widened as she saw what the lioness was doing. From behind a thick bush, a small cub emerged, a tiny ball of fur with bright, curious eyes. The cub was no more than a few weeks old, its legs wobbling as it took its first steps. The lioness watched as her cub stumbled forward, taking cautious steps towards Sarah. This was unexpected. The lioness was allowing her cub to come closer, and for a moment, Sarah could hardly believe her eyes. Was this really happening? Was this lioness truly trusting her enough to let her cub approach? The cub, sensing no immediate danger, trotted forward, its eyes locked on Sarah. The tiny creature's movements were unsteady, but it was determined. Sarah knelt down slowly, her hand outstretched in a gesture of peace. She knew that wild animals, especially predators, rarely let their young come near humans. They were protective, and rightfully so. The world was dangerous, and their cubs were their most precious treasures. But this lioness was different. For a moment, everything was still. The cub hesitated, then slowly stepped closer to Sarah's outstretched hand. And that was when the lioness made her decision. With a soft grunt, the lioness turned and walked away, her eyes still watching Sarah closely. She didn't retreat to a safe distance. Instead, she stayed nearby, her watchful eyes scanning the area. It was as if she was giving Sarah permission to interact with her cub. But why? Why would a wild predator, known for its aggressive nature, allow a human to be so close to her young? Sarah could hardly believe what she was witnessing. The lioness wasn't just standing guard. She was showing an incredible level of trust. It was an invitation, not a challenge. The cub took one more hesitant step, then nuzzled Sarah's hand, its tiny nose brushing against her skin. It was a soft, innocent gesture that spoke volumes. Sarah's heart swelled with emotion. She had spent years studying animals, understanding their behavior, but this was something she had never experienced before. The bond between the lioness and her cub was evident, and yet the lioness was allowing Sarah into their world, a world that was normally closed off to humans. As Sarah sat there, the cub's small head resting gently in her palm, she realized that this moment was more than just an encounter. It was a revelation. It was a reminder that animals, even the fiercest predators, were capable of profound trust. And this trust wasn't given lightly. It was earned through respect, patience, and understanding. But the question still lingered in Sarah's mind. Why had the lioness approached her? Why had she allowed her cub to come so close? Was it instinct, or was there something more at play? Sarah knew that she had to find out. This encounter was only the beginning of something much larger. The lioness, watching from a distance, gave a soft grunt, a sound that Sarah interpreted as a warning. It was time to go. She slowly stood up, gently placing the cub back on the ground. The cub lingered for a moment, looking up at Sarah with innocent eyes, before it turned and scurried back toward its mother. As Sarah made her way back through the forest, her mind raced with questions. What had just happened? And more importantly, what did this moment mean for the bond between humans and wild predators? The forest had given her a glimpse into a world she had only ever dreamed of understanding. A world where even the fiercest predators could trust humans with their young. The forest was still and quiet, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. Sarah walked slowly through the dense foliage, the sounds of the wilderness filling her ears, the calls of distant birds, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the occasional snap of a twig beneath her boots. But amid all the natural sounds, one thing was different. The cub's tiny, unsteady footsteps echoed in her mind. The little lion cub was following her, toddling behind with wide, curious eyes. It was a sight Sarah would never forget. The cub, once so tentative around her, was now trusting her completely, following her without hesitation. In the hours since their first encounter, the bond between them had deepened, and Sarah couldn't help but marvel at the way the cub had warmed to her. The lioness had not moved far. She was still nearby, just out of view, but Sarah could feel her presence. It was as if the lioness had stepped into the background, allowing the cub to explore this strange new world without the protective, watchful eye of its mother hovering over every move. The trust between the lioness and Sarah was growing, and it was clear that something extraordinary was unfolding right in front of her eyes. As Sarah crouched down to offer her hand to the cub again, it came closer, sniffing the air around her. The cub's tiny face was full of wonder, its big eyes filled with curiosity. Its fur, still soft and fuzzy, reminded Sarah of a kitten's, but with the potential to become something far more powerful. The cub let out a small growl, more playful than menacing, and nudged her hand gently, as if seeking reassurance. Sarah's heart melted. She had worked with many wild animals in her time, but this was different. This was not the calculated trust that could be trained over time with food or incentives. This was something raw, something instinctive. She knew that the cub could feel her energy, the calm, the gentleness in her touch. It wasn't about domination. It wasn't about control. It was about a quiet understanding. Slowly, she extended her arm a little further, and to her amazement, the cub reached out with its small paws, touching her arm gently. It was a moment of profound connection. The cub wasn't afraid. It wasn't running away or hiding behind its mother. No, the cub was seeking out Sarah, trusting her with its most vulnerable, innocent self. The thought crossed her mind. Why? Why would this wild predator allow a human to be so close to its cub? Sarah had worked with wild animals for years, but never before had she seen such raw, unspoken trust. This wasn't the usual domesticated bond she had experienced with some wildlife in rescue centers. This was an untamed wild predator whose instincts told it to protect its young at all costs. And yet, here it was, allowing a stranger, someone entirely outside its world, into its circle. It was as though the lioness had sensed something in Sarah, a kindred spirit of sorts, someone who could understand the delicate balance between protection and freedom, between human and animal. Perhaps this was the key to the unexpected bond. Perhaps the lioness saw in Sarah someone who wasn't a threat, someone who respected the wild and understood the fragility of life in the wilderness. For the next several hours, Sarah spent time with the cub, letting it play at her feet, watch her movements, and even nuzzle against her hand. Every moment was a quiet reminder of the deep connection between humans and animals. It wasn't something Sarah could easily explain, but she felt it in her bones. It was a sense of mutual respect, of understanding that transcended the boundaries of species. As the day wore on, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting an amber glow across the forest. The cub, tired from its exploration, sat down beside Sarah, curling up in a little ball. It was a peaceful moment, the kind of moment Sarah never took for granted. She watched as the cub's eyes fluttered shut, its tiny body rising and falling with each gentle breath. But even as the cub slept, Sarah could feel the weight of the lioness's watchful gaze. The lioness had not moved far. She was still present, keeping a careful watch over the cub from the shadows. It was a reminder that no matter how much trust had been built between them, the lioness was still a fierce protector. Sarah knew this was not just a moment of curiosity. This was a delicate trust, one that had been built over time, through countless silent gestures of understanding. The lioness had made a decision, one that Sarah could hardly believe. The bond was growing, but the real question was why. Why would a wild predator allow a human to be so close to her cub? Why would she trust a stranger when her instincts should have warned her to protect her young from any potential threat? As Sarah sat there, the weight of the situation settled in. This wasn't just about the cub. This was about something much deeper, a connection between human and animal that went beyond the basic survival instincts. It was about respect for life, for the role each species played in the great circle of nature. It was about a shared understanding that they were not so different after all. As Sarah gently stroked the cub's soft fur, she realized that this was more than just an encounter with a wild animal. It was a moment that would change her forever. It was a reminder that wild animals were not just savage, instinct-driven creatures. They were complex, sentient beings capable of profound connections. The sun was nearly gone now, and Sarah knew it was time to leave. But as she stood, the cub stirred, looking up at her with those wide, innocent eyes. It let out a small mew, a sound so soft and pure that it tugged at Sarah's heartstrings. Without thinking, she bent down and kissed the cub gently on its tiny head. The lioness, who had been watching from a distance, took a step forward, but this time, Sarah did not feel the fear she had felt earlier. She knew the lioness was simply checking on her cub, making sure all was well. It wasn't an act of aggression. It was a final confirmation of trust. Slowly, Sarah turned and began to make her way back toward the edge of the forest. The cub followed for a few steps before it paused, looking back toward its mother. The lioness gave a soft growl, and the cub turned, trotting back to her side. As Sarah left the forest, she couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. She had spent her life studying animals, understanding their behavior, but this was different. This wasn't just about observing from a distance. It was about forging a bond, a deep connection built on mutual respect. And that bond, she realized, was something that could not be explained in mere words. It was a bond that defied the natural order of things, a reminder that even the fiercest predators could trust humans, not because they were forced to, but because they saw something in them worth trusting. And for Sarah, it was a lesson that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting an amber glow that seemed to paint the forest in a dreamlike light. The air had cooled, and the faint breeze carried the earthy scent of the wild. But something was wrong. Sarah could feel it, an undercurrent of tension in the air, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The forest, usually filled with the sounds of rustling leaves and birdsong, was eerily quiet. Sarah stood still, her senses on high alert. She was no stranger to the forest. She had spent years working with animals and had learned to read the signs. But today was different. Today, she wasn't just observing the animals from a distance. She was part of their world. The bond between her and the lioness, and especially the cub, had deepened in ways Sarah never could have imagined. But the danger wasn't far away. She could feel it. The cub had been following her for hours, trotting along behind her with an innocent curiosity that made Sarah smile. She had become attached to the little creature in such a short amount of time. It was as if the cub had chosen her as a protector, and Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of that responsibility. But as the evening wore on, the quiet became unbearable. There were no sounds of wildlife, no chirping birds, no rustling animals. The silence was almost oppressive. It was in moments like this that Sarah knew danger was near. She crouched low, motioning for the cub to stop. It froze beside her, its small body trembling with instinctual fear. The air felt thick, heavy, as if something powerful was lurking just beyond their sight. Sarah's eyes scanned the dense forest around her, her heart racing. She had worked with predators before, but this felt different. Suddenly, the silence was broken. The unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, thundering and deliberate, echoed through the trees. The ground beneath Sarah's feet seemed to vibrate with each step. Her pulse quickened. She knew that sound, the unmistakable sound of another predator's approach. A growl, low and menacing, reverberated through the air. The cub's fur bristled. It let out a small, frightened growl, its tiny body trembling as it instinctively sought shelter behind Sarah. The mother lioness, who had been nearby, reacted immediately. She darted into the clearing, her body tense, her eyes narrowed with an unmistakable warning. And then Sarah saw it. A large male lion stepped out of the trees, his massive body emerging from the shadows like a dark force of nature. His mane was thick and wild, the golden hairs glinting in the dimming light. His eyes locked onto Sarah and the cub, and for a moment, Sarah felt as if she were frozen in place. There was no mistaking it. The male lion was not here for a friendly visit. The lion's eyes flicked to the cub, and Sarah could see the flicker of something dangerous in his gaze. He wasn't just a predator. He was a challenge, a force to be reckoned with. The air seemed to crackle with the raw energy of the encounter. The lioness, who had been standing at the edge of the clearing, took a protective step forward, positioning herself between Sarah and the male lion. Her body was tense, her muscles coiled like a spring, ready to defend her cub at any cost. But Sarah could see the hesitation in the lioness's eyes. She knew the male lion was a greater threat than she could handle alone. Sarah's mind raced. She knew that this was a moment of extreme danger. The male lion was an apex predator, strong, fierce, and capable of taking down any threat with ease. And yet, despite his overwhelming strength, he wasn't the real threat in this moment. The real danger came from the possibility of a misunderstanding. The possibility that the lioness might view Sarah as a threat to her cub, or worse, that the male lion might perceive Sarah as an intruder. The lioness growled lowly, a sound that was both a warning and a plea. She looked at Sarah, her eyes flickering between her and the male lion. It was as if she were asking for help, but also preparing for the worst. In that moment, Sarah realized that this was a test. The lioness had trusted her with her cub, but now the real question was whether Sarah could be trusted to protect the cub in this moment of crisis. Without thinking, Sarah reached for her belt, her fingers brushing the small tranquilizer gun she carried for situations like this. It was a tool she used only when absolutely necessary, when the danger was too great, and there was no other way to protect herself or the animals she worked with. But she hesitated. She didn't want to use it. Not on the lion. Not unless it was absolutely necessary. The male lion let out another growl, this one louder and more threatening. His body was tense, his muscles rippling beneath his golden fur. He was ready to pounce at any moment. The lioness stepped forward, her body low to the ground, her eyes locked on the male lion. Sarah could see that the lioness wasn't backing down. She was preparing for a fight, determined to protect her cub at all costs. But there was a subtle difference in her movements, a hesitation that only Sarah could detect. The lioness wasn't fighting out of aggression. She was fighting out of desperation, out of a desire to protect. The male lion took another step forward, his eyes never leaving the cub. Sarah could see that he wasn't intimidated by the lioness. He was here for one thing only, the cub. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She knew that this was a moment of life or death. If the male lion decided to attack, there would be no time to react. But she couldn't let that happen. She couldn't let the cub be hurt. The lioness lunged. It was a blur of movement. Fur, claws, and teeth. The male lion and the lioness collided in midair, their roars filling the air as they fought with incredible speed and ferocity. The ground beneath Sarah's feet trembled with the force of their battle. Sarah stood frozen, her hand still hovering over the tranquilizer gun, unsure whether to intervene. But as the two lions fought, something unexpected happened. The male lion's attention shifted. His eyes, still burning with rage, flicked to the cub behind Sarah. The momentary distraction was enough. The male lion's focus wavered, and in that split second, the lioness used the opportunity to knock him off balance. The male lion stumbled backward, growling in frustration. It was then that Sarah made her move. With a quick, decisive motion, she drew the tranquilizer gun and aimed it at the male lion. She didn't hesitate. She fired. The dart hit its mark, and the male lion staggered, his body swaying slightly as the tranquilizer took effect. His eyes widened in confusion, and then with a final growl, he collapsed to the ground, unconscious. The battle was over. The lioness, breathing heavily, stood over the fallen male, her eyes still narrowed with caution. She glanced at Sarah, her expression unreadable. The cub, still hidden behind Sarah, peeked out from behind her, its tiny face filled with curiosity and confusion. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence of the forest returned, but it was a different kind of silence, a quiet that signified relief, but also a sense of uncertainty. Sarah lowered the tranquilizer gun, her hands trembling slightly. She had never had to use it in such a high-stakes situation. The male lion would be fine in a few hours, but the encounter had left her shaken. The lioness approached cautiously, her eyes never leaving the unconscious male. Slowly, she turned towards Sarah, her gaze softening. It was as if she were acknowledging Sarah's role in the moment, the role she had played in protecting the cub. And then, in a quiet, subtle gesture, the lioness lowered her head. It was a sign of respect. The forest was peaceful once again, its usual symphony of sounds gradually returning. The distant chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze, and the soft murmurs of the forest floor came alive as Sarah sat quietly beside the fallen male lion. His body, now relaxed and breathing steadily, had succumbed to the tranquilizer dart. He was safe, for now. The lioness, though, had remained vigilant, her sharp eyes never straying far from the male, even as she cautiously circled him. Sarah's heart still raced from the intense confrontation. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, but the urgency of the moment had passed. The tension that had held the forest in its grip slowly began to dissipate. The danger had been averted. The cub, still close by, ventured cautiously from its hiding spot behind Sarah, its tiny steps tentative but eager, its eyes wide with curiosity. It seemed as though the little creature had finally begun to understand that the battle was over and that its safety was once again ensured. The lioness, too, had begun to relax. Her body was still poised, but the fierce glint in her eyes had softened. Her gaze flickered between the unconscious male lion and Sarah. In that brief, fleeting moment, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude and connection to this wild creature, whose maternal instincts had been so incredibly strong. Despite the lioness's fierce protectiveness, there was something deeper, a quiet recognition that they were no longer strangers. The cub, sensing the shift in energy, nudged its mother gently, its small face nuzzling against her fur. The lioness turned, gazing down at her cub with an expression of warmth and tenderness that only a mother could possess. Sarah felt a quiet awe as she observed the scene. She had witnessed the raw power of nature, but this was something different. This was the delicate balance between danger and protection, strength and vulnerability. For a moment, the lioness and her cub shared a silent exchange, their bond unspoken yet undeniable. Sarah had seen that bond before in her years of working with animals, whether it was in the wild or in a sanctuary, but never had she witnessed it so clearly and so profoundly as she did now. It was a reminder that the wild was not just about survival and fear. It was about love, loyalty, and connection. The male lion began to stir slightly, his body shifting as the effects of the tranquilizer began to wear off. The lioness, seeing that he was regaining consciousness, gave him a final cautionary look before turning her gaze back to Sarah. This was the moment. The lioness had decided. She had placed her trust in Sarah, and now it was up to her to prove that the bond they had formed was more than just an accidental encounter. Sarah stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and calm. She could feel the weight of the lioness's eyes on her, watching, waiting. The cub had already scurried off to play in the underbrush, its small body bounding through the tall grass. Sarah could see that the lioness was content now, content to let her cub roam freely, secure in the knowledge that the human who had been standing by it was not a threat. But there was one more task at hand, one final gesture that would solidify the trust between them. Sarah approached the lioness slowly, keeping her body language open and non-threatening. The lioness did not flinch or retreat. Instead, she stood her ground, her muscles relaxed but still alert, her amber eyes fixed on Sarah as if measuring her intentions. Sarah took a deep breath and held out her hand, palm open, fingers spread. She had no idea what would happen next. Would the lioness allow her to get close? Would she pull back in caution, remembering the ferocity of the earlier confrontation? Or would she accept this final sign of peace? The lioness hesitated for a moment. And then, without warning, she took a slow, deliberate step forward. Her large, powerful body moved with grace, each step calculated, as if she were testing the air between them. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The moment felt suspended in time, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. And then the lioness did something that Sarah could not have predicted. She nuzzled Sarah's hand, her rough, warm tongue brushing against her palm in a gesture so gentle it took Sarah by surprise. It was a sign of trust, a simple, profound act that spoke louder than any words could. The lioness was not just allowing Sarah to be near her cub. She was offering a silent acknowledgement of the bond they had forged. It was a bond based not on dominance or fear, but on respect. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she stood there, her hand resting gently on the lioness's thick fur. She had never felt more connected to the wild, more connected to the heart of nature itself. In that moment, she knew that the connection she had with these animals was not one that could be easily broken. It was a bond forged in the rawness of the wild, but tempered by the shared understanding between species. As the male lion stirred more fully, Sarah slowly stepped back, giving him space as he regained his senses. The lioness stepped away from her, but not before casting one final, lingering glance at the woman who had earned her trust. Sarah nodded silently, acknowledging the unspoken message. The lioness had made it clear. She had accepted Sarah into her world, not as an outsider, but as someone who understood.